Let me begin by making two confessions to you. The first is that you are being addressed by a nerd. I am without 900 pens in my pocket today, but they're normally there. And as I think you will see in the course of this lecture, I'd feel better if they were there. The second most important thing is that I am a follower of Jesus Christ. And nothing in my life comes close to that. And I hope you will see in the course of my talk with you that it is the sum total of my life. I'd like to take 2 steps back, if I may. First, is there anyone here from Indiana?
Yeah!
Great, good. I knew that I liked you. I was born and raised in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but I have lived and worked in Washington, D.C., which is a fancy way of saying I have lived and worked inside the Beltway for 25 years. And as a nerd, in good standing, I knew what I wanted to do with my life professionally when I was 7 years old. In fact, my mother tells the story that in the summertime, I was born in 1964 by the year, the last year of the baby boom generation. My mother said that when the neighborhood children would get together to play kickball in the backyard, that about 5:29 in the evening, she would yell out the window, "Tim, it's time to come in, because the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite is starting." You know, that's a true nerd. Actually, it didn't matter anyway, because I was always the last one chosen. I'm sure some of you can identify with that, at least one of you. Okay, 2. Beginning when I was a young child, in a way that I could not have verbalized at the time, I lived on a street in the Midwest where, by God's grace, I had a wonderful family and wonderful friends. But many of the things that interested me as a young boy did not tend to interest a lot of my neighbors. And maybe there are some of you in this room who can identify with me in that regard as well. As a young child, I came to love classical music and jazz and the American Songbook. I remember hearing my first opera. My mother, who is not a college graduate but is an intellectual, introduced to me as a young boy, long before the era of MP3s and everything else, a series of very large albums on vinyl that she had gotten through green stamps at our local grocery store. And I remember very vividly the first time that my mother and I sat down on a summer afternoon, not unlike this, and we listened to Beethoven together. And my young ears had never heard such a thing in all my life. And it's a wonderful memory all of these years later. I also remember the first time that my mother took me to a gallery. And I remember seeing a portrait by John Singer Sargent. And I remember being mesmerized by the beauty of the portrait of the woman that I was viewing. It wasn't an original painting, but many years later I saw the original. And it moved me and touched me very deeply. I also came to love the ballet and sculpture. A very good friend of mine introduced me as a very, very highly regarded sculptor to the intricacies of representational art. Even though on odd days of the week, I also love the abstract expressionists. I remember as a young boy looking at the comparative colors in a Mark Rothko painting. And I was very interested in the chromatic relationship of the colors to one another. And I also remember the first time that I was given a book about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I, as a very young boy, knew that I was beginning a lifelong love affair with reading. In fact, the one and only conversation that I've had at length with any of you took place a few minutes ago in your dining room. And I met a young man there who told me that for much of the next 10 days, he would, in this order, be reading books and walking in the mountains. And at the age of 48, I wish I had 10 days to read books and walk in the mountains. All this to say, above all, as a child, I came to be mesmerized by the English language. I wouldn't know this as a boy, but the man I came to admire most as a statesman was Winston Churchill. And I remember reading the very famous comment that the way that Churchill engaged the Nazis in World War II was by using the English language as the greatest weapon in his arsenal. I remember not knowing what that meant the first time that I read it, but I remember the first time I ever heard Churchill's blood, toil, sweat, and tears speech. And I knew exactly what the writer had meant about Winston Churchill. And I came to see that the greatest journalist of the 20th century, by complete happenstance, was born less than 50 miles from where I was born. He is called Ernie Pyle. He was the greatest print journalist of the second part of the 20th century. And as some of you in this room may know, those of you who are interested in World War II, Ernie Pyle came to fame because of his World War II writing, and in fact was killed in the war doing what he loved to do best, be with the GIs and write about their daily encounter with those who would end our freedoms permanently. And so as a boy, I read everything that Ernie Pyle had ever written. And I knew by the age of 12 or 13 that the thing that I wanted to do more than anything was to be a journalist. Because for me, in a way that I couldn't have verbalized at the time, journalism was that matrix where public policy, politics, great writing, and the action of life would all come together in one fulcrum. And that set my life on a rather remarkable trajectory. I began doing a television program when I was 12 years old. That morphed into a radio program when I was 14, which morphed into another radio program when I was 16. And I did that radio program all the way up to and including the age of 22. It was absolutely terrific, and I had a great time. Now I have to tell you, brother in Christ to brothers and sisters in Christ, that one of the greatest blessings in the Christian life is unpredictability. I want to take one step back. This Labor Day, I will go to my 30th high school reunion. And I remember in my 8th grade study hall, sitting in front of Margie Hyde. You don't know Margie, but actually you do know her. That is to say, there were either girls or boys like this wherever you went to school. They were the ones who always knew what they were going to do up to and including their last day on planet Earth. They were really good planners. If you ever wanted to go on a business trip, they'd be the ones to ask. I remember Margie Hyde getting a big legal pad out one day in our 8th grade study hall, and she said to me very demonstratively, "Tim, what are you going to do with your life?" She said, "Let me tell you what I'm going to do." And she wrote down on the legal pad all the things she was going to do. She ripped it off and she gave it to me. And even at 8th grade, I thought, I'm going to save this and see how Margie's life progresses, because on my legal pad, although I thought I knew, I wasn't ready to commit it to paper. Well, I saw Margie Hyde at my 25th high school reunion. I'm happy to tell you that every box on that legal pad in her life has been checked. She's very proud of that. And she's a very good woman. She should be proud of that. I thought I knew. Based on everything I'm telling you, I thought I was going to go into journalism and spend a life there. But Providence has a way of intervening in your life just when you think you are most confident and most secure about what the next step is. Because completely out of the blue, when I was a junior at Indiana University in Bloomington, I received a call from a woman who was the best friend of the wife of a United States Senator. I had met her a grand total of one time. Her name is Betsy. She said, "Tim, I'm calling to change your life." And I kind of chuckled, and she didn't chuckle. Betsy was a very serious person. And she said to me, "I want you to apply to become an intern in the United States Senate this summer for U.S. Senator Dan Quayle." And I kind of hemmed and hawed, and I didn't see what it had to do with journalism, but I went through the interview, and I was offered the internship, and I went to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1985, and I'm raising my right hand for the first time. My passion in 1985, above all the things I've told you, was tennis. I absolutely love tennis. I love tennis almost as much as books, but not quite as much. And I found that in Washington, D.C., you could be extremely social, and I absolutely love people. You could be very social, play 3 sets in 1 hour, and meet lots of people. And in the summer of 1985, I was an intern in the United States Senate. I met the last generation of a lot of truly great senators, from Goldwater to Moynihan to Byrd to Dole. Had a wonderful summer, played a lot of tennis, and I thought, thank you and good night. But something kind of gets into your bloodstream. Kind of like the first time that I heard the Symphony No. 9 that I was telling you about earlier. And so the next summer, completely out of the blue, I received another call from another man called Curt Smith. And he was a press secretary in the House of Representatives. He said, "I know that you had a wonderful summer on Capitol Hill. Would you be willing to come back and to be an intern in the House of Representatives this summer for Dan Coates, who's a little-known member of the House of Representatives?" And I thought, last summer was really great. And before I could really hesitate, he said, "And I really need you this summer. I really need some help." Now, my calculus was another summer of tennis, another summer on the Hill. I had a great mentor at Indiana University who had been a bigwig at NBC News. He said to me, "If you get that internship in the House of Representatives, I will help arrange an internship at NBC News in Washington on the weekends." And I thought, that's a pretty good deal. And I said yes and yes. And that summer I worked 6.5 days a week, 5 days in the House of Representatives, and all day Saturday and half a day on Sunday, interning at NBC News. I went to meet the press almost every Sunday. And as they say in Texas, I was in clover. I really had a great summer. Then I thought, now I'm done with politics. I became the television news producer at the local NBC affiliate in my hometown of Fort Wayne. I was happy as a clam. And a year and a half later, I received another telephone call. By providence, Dan Quayle had become Vice President of the United States. Dan Coates had become an appointed U.S. Senator, and Dan Coates called and said, "Would you be willing to come back to Washington to be my full-time deputy press secretary overseeing all my radio and television?" And I said yes. I thought that I would only be there a year or two, because he was an appointed U.S. Senator. He had to run 2 elections in 4 years, which, short of scaling Mount McKinley, is about the biggest thing I thought I would ever do. So for 4 years, I lived on airplanes and out of suitcases. Dan Coates raised millions of dollars as an obscure appointed U.S. Senator, won both elections, and asked me to become his press secretary. So what I thought would be a year or two became 3 and 4, and then 6 and 7. And then the next thing I knew, I was with him the entire time he was in the U.S. Senate. And when he decided to retire, I thought, now I am done with politics. And I went to see Dan Coates, and he said, "You're making a big mistake." He said, "You have worked this long at this end of Pennsylvania Avenue. You ought to work in one presidential campaign." And I went to work for the Gary Bauer for President campaign. As with Elizabeth Taylor and her 9 husbands, I thought this won't take long. But Gary did an outstanding job. He didn't stay in for the 3 months that I thought. He stayed in all the way through the New Hampshire primary. When he bowed out, I received a call that I did not expect and was asked to join the Bush-Cheney campaign. At that point, I was married to the love of my life, Jenny. We had 2 boys, ages 1 and 3, and as you will see in my memoir, we drove our Dodge Caravan to Austin, Texas, where for the first 2 weeks it was 112 degrees. Everything was brown and they were in a drought, and I thought about 9 times a day, what have I done? But you will also find in the Christian life that everything that you think is the thing is really only a preparation for the thing. And so we got to Austin, Texas, living in our walk-up 2-bedroom apartment with day laborers who smoked pot every night. We're quite certain they didn't know the meaning of underarm deodorant. And we thought, what have we done? Some of you may remember the 2000 almost election. 2000 was the election, if you don't know, where no one won. My 3-year-old asked me point blank the day after the election, "Daddy, why didn't anyone win?" And those words still haunt me. I was asked 3 days later to pack a suitcase that I would be going to Florida to spend 3 or 4 days there. I flew away and didn't come back for 32 days. Bush v. Gore, as some of you know, was settled in the Supreme Court in the most high-profile and most contentious presidential election in American history. I lived in 9 cities over all those weeks. A big night of sleep was 3.5 hours. We were given 1 day off. I went to Epcot. It was rather surreal. I thought, why are all these people having fun? Don't they know that we have a presidential election to win or lose? Finally, George W. Bush did win, and I was offered a gigantic title. I was offered the title Special Assistant to the President and the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. That's a fancy way of saying that I was the President's chief outreach person to all my fellow Christians and conservatives, a commissioned officer to the President with an office in the White House. If some of you know who Karl Rove is, I was his deputy. I was off on a remarkable journey for someone whose grandfather had come from Macedonia and was illiterate and innumerate, somebody born at 6914 Autumn View Drive to 2 people who were the most extraordinary people in the entire world who never went to college. My father was a painting contractor and my best friend. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is a long way from Autumn View Drive in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I can tell you that if I were to speak to you for the next 9 hours, I could wrap it all up in a bow and you would think, boy, that's an American story. Except for the fact, in the way that you receive Christmas letters every Christmas from people whose entire year has been one mountaintop after the other, you know who those people are. Nothing bad ever happens in their life. Susie is sewing her own clothes. Bobby has memorized all the books of the Bible and can recite them backwards. All their kids scale tall buildings in a single bound. You know these people. Right? The fact of the matter is that the man who's talking to you today is a poor, miserable sinner. In fact, I was a fool. And I'd like to share that with you. A true fool. In Washington, D.C., in Manitou Springs, in Timbuktu, there is a poison, and it's called pride. If you forget everything that I have ever told you, please learn from my example. Because in Washington, pride often takes one of 3 routes. sex, power, or money. It's otherwise known as Potomac fever. Let me give you the best possible illustration. One of my very dear friends, now deceased, was a very famous conservative called William F. Buckley Jr. He's the man who taught me to sail. He once said to me, you know, it's a remarkable thing to go into the Oval Office, as I often did, and to know that the leader of the free world is taking notes while you're speaking. Wow, that's a big deal. In politics, that's the equivalent of winning a gold medal. You have arrived, and it's all about you. Because in all those years that I was living this remarkable life, happily married, father of 2 boys, a Washington resume, which I say from humility was a wonderful thing, I had been writing a column for my hometown newspaper, but never about politics. I wrote about all the other things that interested me: art and music, philosophy and theology, all the things of life. There's always baseball, the Chicago Cubs, another passion of mine. Yeah. We don't know what the playoffs of the World Series are because we're in the 115th year of our rebuilding effort. I always wanted to be the clever one, the one who wrote it better than anybody else. By the way, the one thing that people of pride have in common, the one thing, is deception. Anybody here ever been to a wax museum? That's how people of pride are. They always have the right smile, the right stance, the right thing. They're never wrong. That's what pride had done to me. And so I wanted to write not just a really good column, I wanted everyone to be like Cicero. And so I began plagiarizing some of my columns. Now, I'd like to stand before all of you and tell you that it was because I was under pressure and under stress, and there were 14 extenuating circumstances, but that was not the case. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I did it anyway, over and over and over again. And one day, I came back from a breakfast at the White House, and I popped open my email, and a reporter said to me by email, "I think you have plagiarized this column. Is it true?" And I promise you, just like this, I fell down next to my desk at the White House and I prayed the following: "Oh God, oh God," because it was true. By the way, this is the other thing about people of pride. Eventually, as Shakespeare said, the truth will out. And I went back to my PC and I answered the following: "It is true, I am guilty as charged." Now, in the political classes where I spent my professional life, when you embarrass the president or the senator or the congressman, there is a kind of divorce that takes place. You are cut off. You are persona non grata. And that is fully what I expected and deserved for what I had done. That very day, I wrote a letter to George W. Bush, and I resigned my position at the White House, and I left the White House in total and utter disgrace. It was as if I had opened up the double doors and descended down not into the cellar, but into the subcellar. A hypocrite. God had blessed me with 25 years of incredible interns who were of your generation. And by the way, you are an incredible generation. I let them down very badly. I embarrassed the president, my White House colleagues, not to mention my beloved wife and boys. my parents and everybody who had ever believed in me, trusted in me, confided in me, I was a hypocrite. And when I came in on Monday after the Friday of my resignation to begin taking the pictures off the walls and cleaning out my desk, I received a call, which is the call that no one wants to receive. I went over to see our chief of staff, and he said the words in the White House that as a staffer you never want to hear. They are the following: the boss would like to see you. Now, in White House parlance, if it's good news, the president wants to see you. And if it's bad news, it's the boss. And I was ready for my much anticipated and deserved woodshed moment. So I went to the Oval Office, and it was just the president and me. Anybody here like Bugs Bunny? I do. I love Looney Tunes. When Bugs Bunny is ever in a castle and he shuts the door, there's this, When I shut the door of the Oval Office, it seemed to be an echo that I just knew that the worst was coming. And I turned to George W. Bush, and I looked him squarely in the eyes, and I said, Mr. President, I owe you, and before I could get the words out, he looked at me squarely in the eyes, and he said, Tim, I forgive you. Now, I have to tell you, I've lived on the planet for 48 years. That was one of the most surreal moments of my life. I actually wanted to clear out my ear and essentially ask him to repeat himself. And so for the second time, I said, Mr. President. And before I could get my apology out, he said to me, Tim, grace and mercy are real. I'm extending them to you. You're forgiven. And I was shocked. And I said, Mr. President, you should have taken me by the lapels and tossed me into Pennsylvania Avenue for what I had done. And I expected a rejoinder or a retort, and he said to me, Tim, I'm going to say it again. You are forgiven. Grace and mercy are real. I've known them in my life, and I'm extending them to you. You're forgiven. He said, now we can talk about all this for the next 20 or 30 minutes, or we can talk about the last 8 years. And so I walked over to sit on one of the two couches in the Oval Office. He said, no. He said, sit over here. And he directed me toward the chair, the place of honor, below the famous portrait of George Washington, where either the vice president or a visiting head of state sits when they come to see the president. We spoke together. We prayed together. We embraced, and I thought, this is the last time I will ever see George W. Bush. And as I was leaving, he said, oh, and by the way, I want you to bring your wife and children here so that I can tell them what a wonderful husband and father you've been. Let me just tell you all, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, or none of the above or all of the above, depending on the day or time of week, that's not how presidents act. And sure enough, my wife and children were invited to come to the Oval Office. He gave them gifts, hugs all around, kept his promise, and George W. Bush and I have become friends. Now, it's very tempting for me to stand at a podium in an election year of all things and to make grandiose statements about this relationship between politics and our faith. And I can tell you that this is the greatest country in the history of man without peer, and that as Christians living in America, every day is Thanksgiving Day. Yesterday was D-Day, and you all know what an extraordinary day that is for our country. But I can tell you that for all the theoretical and philosophical discussions about faith and politics, for me, at the very nadir and the lowest point of my life, I was extended a grace and a mercy and a love and a forgiveness that could have only come from Jesus Christ. So the takeaway is singular. That Proverbs is right, that pride does go before the fall, and it does. And so as I say, if you have forgotten already everything I've said, and that's perfectly fine, I hope if there's even one person in this room today who is prideful by nature, that you will make a commitment between you and God before the sun sets, that you will toss pride out on its ear before the close of this day. But I want to say something proactive and something far more important. Humility is endless. And those three words, I think, are the most beautiful, sequential three words in the English language. They were written by my favorite poet, T.S. Eliot. Humility is endless. Humility, in my view, is the seedbed of true greatness. And in the Christian life, it is the seedbed of our obedience to God Himself and love and service to other people. It's very tempting in a cerebral room like this, where there are Dante and Augustine and Shakespeare and Milton, and the list is endless. All these ideas bouncing off the walls in this continual conversation that goes on, which I think is so great. It's tempting for me to leave you all by saying intellect is really preeminent, but it is not. I hope there are lots of straight A students here who have aced SATs and all the other acronyms and are serving and doing great things because of your intellect. That's great. And I honor that, truly. But I have learned that in the real world, it's run by B and C students. And that at the end of the day, that it is character and integrity before intellect. That character and integrity are preeminent, and that everything else follows therefrom. So at the expense of lecturing or being Solomonic, I will happily end there and answer or duck a few questions on any topic. Thank you all very much.